In 2008, inside Denisova cave in the Altai mountains of Siberia, archaeologists recovered a bone fragment no wider than a thumbnail. It belonged to the fifth finger of a child 5 to 7 years old at the time of death somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 years ago. When geneticists at the Max Planck Institute sequenced what remained inside it, the result was neither modern human nor Neanderthal. It was something else entirely. An entire species previously unknown to science, announced by a single fragment of a child's smallest finger. The detail is small, and it refuses to go away. Tonight we trace what that small bone opened, because the Denisovans were not an anomaly. They were one branch in what we now understand to have been a crowded family, a world once populated by at least 8 distinct human species, each adapted, each persistent, each fully real. The question this documentary will follow is not simply who they were, but what it means that they are gone. We will move through 4 layers of evidence: the fossil record and its gaps, the ancient DNA that speaks when bones cannot, the tools and fires and possible rituals that hint at the minds behind them, and the slow convergence of forces, climate competition, interbreeding, and perhaps disease that narrowed this diverse family tree down to a single remaining branch. We will not arrive at a clean answer. The record does not offer one, but it does preserve the shape of the question, and tonight that is enough to follow. For most of the time that humans have existed on this planet, the word human described something plural, not one species managing its survival in isolation, but a loose and scattered family groups living in ranges that sometimes overlapped, sometimes diverged for hundreds of thousands of years, then drew close again. Cold air moving through a cave mouth in winter. The sound of stone worked against stone somewhere in the dark. These were not the experiences of one people, they were the shared conditions of many. The genus Homo first appears into the fossil record at around 2.8 million years ago. What followed was not a straight march toward modern humans. It was something closer to an explosion. Adaptive radiation biologists call it a single lineage branching outward into multiple species, each finding its own solution to the problem of existence. Homo erectus walked out of Africa nearly 2 million years ago, kept walking, settling across 3 continents, surviving for so long that if you compressed all of the recorded human history into a single afternoon, erectus would have lasted the equivalent of several months before it. They were the great persisters. They built no cities and left no writing, but they carried fire across half the known world and passed the knowledge of it down through roughly 100,000 generations. They were not alone for long. By 500,000 years ago, the family tree had branched into what we now call Homo heidelbergensis, broad-shouldered, large-brained hunters who shaped javelin, balanced wooden spears at a site into northern Germany 300,000 years before Neanderthals reached their full form. From populations like these, at least 3 major lineages would eventually diverge: Neanderthals moving west into Ice Age Europe, Denisovans ranging east across the high plateaus and forests of Asia, and the ancestral line still evolving in Africa that would become us. The family was spreading, the branches were multiplying, and then there were the others, the ones that do not fit neatly into any of those familiar names. On the island of Flores in Indonesia, a species now called Homo floresiensis persisted until perhaps 50,000 years ago, adults standing barely a metre tall with brains roughly the size of a grapefruit, yet leaving behind stone tools sophisticated enough to bring down dwarf elephants weighing many times their own body weight. That combination, the smallest known human brain in the late Pleistocene, paired with evidence of coordinated big game hunting, still does not have a fully agreed explanation. Some researchers suggest it is evidence that intelligence is not simply a function of brain volume, but of how that volume is organised and was handled. Others remain cautious. The data they note is still incomplete, but the bones and the butchery marks are there. They do not go away either. On the island of Luzon in the Philippines, Homo luzonensis left behind curved finger bones and primitive-looking teeth alongside evidence of human presence, stretching back 700,000 years, features so mosaic, so seemingly assembled from different evolutionary periods that researchers could not assign them to any known lineage when the species was formally named in 2019. And beneath the ground in South Africa, in a chamber so narrow that the scientists who excavated it were specifically selected for their small frames and their tolerance for confined darkness, Hundreds of bones belonging to Homo naledi were found in arrangements that, if deliberate, would imply a species with a brain half the size of ours was already carrying its dead to a specific hidden place and returning there across generations. Whether that constitutes ritual is a word researchers still use with careful hesitation. What unites all of these, the Denisovan child in Siberia, the small hunters of Flores, the mosaic-boned people of Luzon, the possible grave-keepers of Rising Star Cave, the cold-adapted survivors of Ice Age Europe, whose DNA still moves through the cells of people alive today, is not proof of any single story. It is a pattern, not proof. A pattern. And somewhere inside that pattern is a question the fossil record and the genome together can approach but not quite reach what exactly ended all of them. What narrowed the long branching plural human family down to this one species alone, asking the question from the inside, we will not resolve it here. But we follow now where the evidence leads through bone and molecule and the quiet anomalies that keep surfacing in the record generation after generation of researchers refusing to be explained away. We begin at the oldest branch, the first walker. A hillside in what is now the Republic of Georgia 8 million years ago. The light is flat and cold. On a slope above a river valley that would one day be called the Alazani, a group of individuals moved through open woodland, upright, long-legged, carrying simple stone tools. They had come from Africa. How long the journey took, measured in generations rather than miles, we cannot say with confidence. But the bones they left behind in sediment beneath a place later named Dmanisi tell us this much: they were here far from any origin point we can trace for our genus, and they were already comfortable in a landscape that had never known anything like them. The Dmanisi fossils are among the oldest human remains found outside Africa, and they carry a quality that field researchers often describe in careful hedged language, a sense of transition still in progress. The skulls show brain volumes ranging from roughly 600 to 775 cubic centimeters smaller than what we typically associate with later Homo erectus populations, yet the bodies attached to them were already built for distance. Long legs relative to arm length, a narrow pelvis, an inner ear structure calibrated for balance during sustained bipedal movement. Whatever these individuals were in terms of taxonomy, and that question has generated substantial disagreement across several decades, they were walkers in a way their predecessors were not. Homo erectus. The name given to the broader lineage they likely represent appeared in the fossil record of East Africa around 2 million years ago. Within a geologically brief interval, populations had reached the Caucasus. By 1.5 million years ago, they had arrived on the island of Java at sites like Sangaran, where dozens of individuals would eventually be recovered from volcanic deposits laid down across an enormous span of time. The youngest confirmed erectus fossils from Southeast Asia have been dated to somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years before the present. That means this single lineage, if it is indeed a single lineage which some researchers debate persisted for roughly 2 million years. To put that against something measurable, modern Homo sapiens have existed as a recognizable species for perhaps 300,000 years. Erectus outlasted us by a factor of nearly 7, in a world without agriculture, without writing, without any of the institutional structures we now assume are necessary for the long-term survival. What carried them so far and kept them viable so long was not, by most current assessments, unusual intelligence in the modern sense. Their brains averaged around 900 cubic centimeters, substantially larger than earlier hominins, but well below the range of Neanderthals or ourselves. What they seem to have possessed, and what the archaeological record preserves in fragments, was something more fundamental: a capacity for reliable cultural transmission. The Acheulean hand axe, that teardrop-shaped stone tool, whose basic form appears at erectus sites across 3 continents and across nearly 1 million years of occupation, is not a simple object. It is a designed object, one that required a mental template, fine motor control, and the ability to teach and be taught. Archaeologists have found hand axes so geometrically consistent across sites, separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of thousands of years, that the only reasonable explanation is sustained, accurate transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. That is not instinct, that is tradition. They also, at some point in their long history, encountered fire and learned to keep it. The evidence is difficult to date precisely. Charcoal and ash can be deposited by natural processes, and hearth structures do not always survive in recognizable form. But by around 1 million years ago, possibly earlier sites in South Africa, China, and the Levant show patterns that most researchers now interpret as deliberate and repeated fire use, burned bones with cut marks suggesting cooked meat clusters of activity around what appear to be central hearths, and perhaps most tellingly the successful colonization of high-latitude environments where winter survival without fire would be almost impossible. Fire changes everything it touches. It extends the range of edible foods. It extends the range of habitable climates. It creates a focal point around which groups gather and almost tit-tat-tat communicate in ways that go beyond the functional. What those communications sounded like we cannot know. The anatomical evidence for complex speech in erectus populations is limited and contested. The hyoid bone, which anchors the tongue musculature and provides indirect evidence about vocal capacity, is rarely preserved. Brain endocasts internal molds of the skull that preserve rough impressions of surface brain structure suggest some degree of asymmetry consistent with language-associated regions, but the resolution of such evidence is too coarse for confident interpretation. What we can say is that whatever system of communication they used was sufficient to coordinate hunts of large animals, to teach tool-making across generations, and to navigate landscapes across multiple continents without losing the cultural thread that kept their technology recognizable across an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. By around 400,000 years ago, erectus populations in Africa and Europe were being displaced or absorbed by the successor species. In Asia they held on longer, their range contracting slowly through the Middle and late Pleistocene until the last individuals, if the youngest dates from Java are accurate, disappeared from the record at roughly the same time modern humans were beginning to move through the region. Whether those final populations encountered sapiens interbred with them or simply faded in isolation remains an open question. No confirmed erectus DNA has been recovered. The molecular record from that lineage is for now silent. What is not silent is the shape of what they built and the distance they travelled. The first chapter of the human family's long history outside Africa was written in stone and ashen bone by a species that refused for nearly 2 million years to stop moving. The next chapter was written by their descendants, and it is a chapter that begins with wooden spears. The spear makers of the Middle World. A spruce tree growing on the edge of a lake in northern Germany 300,000 years ago would not have known it was being selected. But the individuals who walked toward it that morning, broad-shouldered, heavy-browed with brains already approaching the volume we carry in our own skulls, were not choosing it at random. They were looking for something specific, the densest wood found nearest the base, where the grain ran tight and the fibres would hold their shape through the stress of a long cast. What they shaped from that wood and what was later recovered from waterlogged sediment at the site now called Schöningen are the oldest preserved hunting weapons yet found anywhere on Earth. 8 wooden shafts each between 1.8 and 2.5 metres in length, tapered at both ends with their centres of gravity positioned like a modern javelin approximately 1/3 of the way from the front tip. They were not sticks sharpened out of desperation. They were engineered objects made by people who understood balance, trajectory, and the mechanics of a thrown weapon before any of those concepts had a name. The species responsible for those spears is called Homo heidelbergensis, named for a jawbone recovered from a sandpit near the German town of Heidelberg in 1907. That jaw was enormous, thick-boned, projecting without the chin that characterizes modern humans, yet too advanced in its dental structure and overall proportions to belong comfortably with earlier forms like erectus. For decades, fossils like it circulated through taxonomy in a kind of limbo, labelled variously as archaic Homo sapiens, or pre-Neanderthal, or simply set aside as problematic. Over time, as comparable remains surfaced in England, Italy, Greece, Ethiopia, Zambia and South Africa, a coherent picture began to emerge. These were people who lived roughly between 700,000 and 300,000 years ago, with brains frequently ranging from 1,100 to 1,400 cubic centimetres, bodies built for serious physical work in demanding environments and a range that extended from the temperate woodlands of Western Europe to the open savannas of Eastern and Southern Africa. They were not a single tightly defined species in any clean taxonomic sense. They were most likely a cluster of related populations spread across the Old World at a time of significant climatic instability, populations that shared a general body plan and a general level of cognitive capacity, while developing regional variations that over hundreds of thousands of years would eventually diverge into at least 3 distinct descendant lineages. Those descendants are the reason heidelbergensis matters so much to the broader story. The European and Western Asian populations appear to have been the direct ancestors of Neanderthals. Their faces would grow more projecting over time, their brow ridges more dramatically arched, their bodies increasingly stocky as selection pressures and glacial environments intensified. The Asian populations, possibly already beginning to diverge by the Middle Pleistocene, may have contributed to or overlapped with the lineage we now call Denisovans, though the genetic and fossil evidence connecting those two groups remains partial and contested. And the African population, sometimes called Homo rhodesiensis, sometimes Homo bodoensis, depending on which taxonomic framework the researcher prefers, were moving slowly and unevenly in the direction that would eventually produce our own species. The fork in the human road did not happen at one moment in one place. It was a long, gradual spreading of paths across a continent spanning landscape driven by geography, climate, and the slow accumulation of small differences across isolated generations. The Schoningen spears sit at the centre of this story not merely as artefacts, but as evidence of a cognitive threshold. To make a balanced throwing weapon from a living tree requires a sequence of decisions that unfolds over hours or days, selecting the right wood, cutting it at the right angle, shaping the taper with stone tools, drying, and possibly hardening the tip, then testing and adjusting the weight distribution until the flight is predictable. Each step requires holding a mental model of the finished object while working on the unfinished one. What cognitive scientists sometimes call prospective memory, the ability to act in the present on behalf of a future state that does not yet exist. That capacity is not unique to modern humans, but its subdominant presence in a population living 300,000 years ago, in a form sophisticated enough to produce weapons that a trained javelin athlete today would recognize as functional, is a reminder that the cognitive distance between heidelbergensis and ourselves may be considerably smaller than the gap between our skulls suggests. The hunting record associated with these populations reinforces that impression. At sites across Europe and Africa, the remains of large animals, elephants, rhinoceroses, horses, hippos, or aurochs show systematic butchery patterns, cut marks at the joints where the most meat-bearing bones articulate percussion fractures, where marrow is extracted, disarticulation sequences that suggest not random hacking, but an organized approach to processing a large carcass efficiently. To bring down a horse or rhinoceros with a wooden spear requires more than strength. It requires knowledge of the animal's behavior, familiarity with the landscape, and the kind of coordinated group action that implies communication sophisticated enough to assign roles and execute a plan under conditions of noise, movement, and danger. The Schoningen site itself yielded the butchered remains of at least 10 horses alongside those 8 spears, a kill site, not a scavenging location laid down in a single episode of organised hunting by a group working together toward a shared objective. What is harder to trace in the archaeological record of heidelbergensis, and what makes the transition to their descendants so difficult to pinpoint precisely, is any clear evidence of the symbolic behaviour that later defines Neanderthals and modern humans. There are hints, a few sites with apparent pigment use, some ambiguous markings on bone-isolated objects, whose function is not obviously utilitarian. But the pattern is not consistent, and researchers disagree about whether these represent genuine symbolic activity or functional behaviours that happen to leave ambiguous traces. The absence may reflect preservation rather than reality. Organic materials, perishable objects, and behavioural patterns that leave no physical residue vanish completely from the record, leaving only what stone and bone and sediment happen to hold. What heidelbergensis passed to their descendants was not, as far as we can currently tell, a fully articulated symbolic culture. It was something perhaps more fundamental, the physical architecture of a large, capable brain housed in a powerful body already equipped with tools, fire, and coordinated hunting and ready over hundreds of thousands of years of diverging selection to develop into forms we would eventually recognize as unmistakably human. Those forms emerge next in Europe in the cold and the dark, shaped by pressures that heidelbergensis never fully encountered. The cold architects. Consider what it takes to survive 9 months of winter year after year for 350,000 years. Not to endure it reluctantly, not to retreat southward at the first frost, but to build an entire way of life around it, to read the migration patterns of woolly rhinoceroses, the way a sailor reads currents to know which cave mouth offers the right combination of shelter and sightline to keep a fire alive through nights cold enough to freeze the marrow in an unburied bone. Neanderthals did not simply tolerate Ice Age Europe. They mastered it in the full sense of that word, across a span of time that dwarfs everything we call civilization by a factor of roughly 70. When the first Neanderthal skeleton was pulled from the Neander Valley in Germany in 1856, the scientists who examined it saw the heavy brow ridges and the robust bones and reached for the most available framework their century offered. Here was a primitive, a brute, a failed part experiment that the march of human progress had sensibly left behind. That interpretation was wrong in almost every detail, and the process of correcting it has taken the better part of 170 years, and is in some respects still ongoing. The skull that most immediately challenges the old dismissal is not a particularly dramatic specimen. It comes from a cave in southwestern France called La Chapelle-aux-Saints, and it belonged to an elderly male who died somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago. When researchers examined the skeleton carefully, they found that this individual had lost most of his teeth many years before his death. Not at the moment of death, but long before it, as evidenced by the degree to which the jawbone had remodeled itself around the empty sockets, a process that takes years. He also showed severe osteoarthritis across multiple joints, a healed fracture of the hip, and a degree of physical deterioration that would have made independent hunting essentially impossible. He could not have fed himself reliably. He required for an extended period before his death the sustained care of others' food prepared in a form he could consume protection attention. That his group provided this, rather than leaving him, is not a minor detail. It is evidence of a social bond that extended beyond immediate utility of a community that maintained its oldest and least productive members, not because doing so was efficient, but because something in their social architecture made it the only imaginable response to need. The Neanderthal brain, measured across hundreds of specimens, averaged approximately 1,500 cubic centimeters, slightly larger on average than the modern human mean of around 1,400. Brain size is not a straightforward proxy for intelligence, and researchers are careful not to overread the comparison. Sperm whales have brains 6 times larger than ours. But when two closely related species with broadly similar neural architecture are compared, size does carry some weight, and the consistent finding that Neanderthals were not neurologically disadvantaged relative to ourselves has forced a substantial revision of the earlier dismissive picture. What the brain endocasts and comparative genomics together suggest is not a species working with reduced cognitive capacity, but one whose mental organization differed from ours in ways that are difficult to characterize. Precisely, possibly more focused on spatial memory and physical problem solving, possibly less oriented toward the kind of open-ended, symbolic abstraction that eventually produced cave paintings and long-distance trade networks, though even that distinction becomes harder to maintain as the archaeological record accumulates more evidence of Neanderthal symbolic behavior. That evidence is scattered, disputed, and in some cases genuinely surprising. In the cave of Cueva de Ardales, in southern Spain, painted signs, dots, lines, handprints rendered in red ochre have been dated using uranium-thorium methods to more than 65,000 years before the present. Modern humans did not reach Europe until approximately 45,000 years ago. The gap between those two dates is 20,000 years, enough time for the entire span of recorded human history to unfold twice over. If the dating is accurate, and it has been contested by some researchers who argue that the uranium-thorium method can produce anomalous results in certain cave environments, then the pigment on those walls was placed there by Neanderthal hands, by minds that chose to make a mark that served no obvious functional purpose in a space that required deliberate entry and the presence of artificial light to navigate. Whether that constitutes art in the full sense, whether it reflects something like aesthetic intention or symbolic communication, is a question that the marks themselves cannot answer. What they can do is refuse to be explained away as accidental. The Mammosterian tool tradition, which appears across Neanderthal sites from the Atlantic coast of Europe to the steppes of Central Asia, offers a different kind of evidence for the cognitive life of this species. These were not simple chopped flints. The production of a Masterian point, the kind of hafted stone tip that Neanderthals attached to wooden shafts to create composite spears, required a specific sequence of preparatory flaking steps called the Levallois technique, in which the toolmaker shaped the entire surface of a stone core before removing the intended flake in a single controlled strike. The process requires holding a three-dimensional mental model of an object that does not yet exist while systematically working toward it across a series of intermediate steps, each of which must be executed correctly for the final form to emerge. And to attach that point to a shaft, Neanderthals produced birch bark tar, a substance made by heating birch bark to specific temperatures in a low oxygen environment, a process that cannot happen accidentally, and that requires either covering the burning material or creating a controlled chamber to exclude air. That is chemistry, not metaphorical chemistry, not proto-chemistry in some diminished sense, an actual controlled chemical transformation, reproducible, teachable, and apparently standard practice across Neanderthal populations. It's separated by thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years. The detail that continues to surface in the Neanderthal record, and that researchers return to with a combination of caution and genuine unease, is the treatment of the dead. At Shandidar Cave in northern Iraq, at La Ferracier in France, at Kabara in Israel, and at several other sites across the Neanderthal range, bodies were placed in deliberate arrangements, sometimes in curved postures, sometimes oriented along consistent axes, sometimes in locations that appear to have been selected rather than simply convenient. The Shanidar individuals, some of whom show healed injuries severe enough that survival required long-term group support, were found in a cluster that early researchers interpreted as a flower burial, based on pollen samples recovered from the sediment. That specific interpretation has been largely abandoned. Rodent activity can deposit pollen in layers without any human agency, but the deliberate placement of the bodies themselves has not been seriously challenged. You do not arrange a body carefully unless the arrangement means something. You do not return to the same site across multiple generations to deposit your dead unless the site itself carries a significance that outlasts any individual life. Whatever that significance was, it was shared, transmitted, and sustained across time, which is to say it was cultural in the most fundamental sense of the word. What ended them is a question the next chapter begins to approach. But first, there is another branch of the family tree to account for one whose existence was entirely unknown until a child's finger bone was pulled from Siberian sediment and sent to a laboratory in Leipzig. The ghost lineage. The bone fragment recovered from Denisova Cave in 2008 measured approximately 3 centimeters. It came from the 5th digit of a child's left hand, the smallest finger, the outermost one, and it had been sitting in sediment at an elevation of roughly 700 meters in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia for somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 years. When Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig extracted genetic material from that fragment and began sequencing it, they expected to find either a Neanderthal or an early modern human. What they found was neither. The mitochondrial DNA was human in its general structure, but diverged from both known lineages at a depth suggesting a population that had been genetically separate for perhaps 400,000 years, long enough to accumulate differences that placed it unambiguously in a category of its own. An entire branch of the human family previously invisible in the fossil record in the archaeological literature, in every reconstruction of our evolutionary history produced over the preceding century and a half, announced itself through 3 centimeters of a child's smallest finger. The species was named Denisovans after the cave where the fragment was found, and almost immediately the geographic story embedded in their DNA created a problem that the physical evidence could not resolve. When geneticists began searching modern human genomes for traces of Denisovan ancestry, they found it not in Siberia, not in the populations living closest to the cave where the only confirmed remains had been recovered, but in Melanesia, in Aboriginal Australian communities in the islands of the Philippines and eastern Indonesia. People living in Papua New Guinea carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. Tibetan Highlanders carry a specific Denisovan gene variant at a frequency of approximately 87% in the modern population. The physical remains of this species had been found in one cave in the mountains of Central Asia, and their genetic legacy was concentrated on the other side of Wallace's Line, in some of the most remote island environments on the planet. The distribution made no sense under any model that assumed a single geographically restricted Denisovan population. It required instead a species that had spread across an enormous range from Siberian highlands to tropical archipelagos, adapting to radically different environments along the way, and doing so largely without leaving fossils we have yet found. The Tibetan gene designated EPAS 1 offers one of the clearest windows into what that adaptation looked like in practice. At elevations above 4,000 meters, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere drops to roughly 60% of its sea level value. Most human populations that move to such altitudes experience chronic mountain sickness. The body, attempting to compensate for low oxygen availability, overproduces red blood cells until the blood thickens, straining the heart and raising the risk of stroke and pregnancy complications. The Denisovan version of EPAS-1 regulates this response differently, allowing efficient oxygen use without triggering the overproduction cascade. It is not a subtle variant, it is a qualitatively different solution to a specific physiological problem, one that Denisovan populations apparently developed over hundreds of thousands of years of life on the Tibetan Plateau, and one that was transferred to modern human populations moving into high-altitude regions through interbreeding. Natural selection then did what it does efficiently within a relatively small number of generations. The variant spread through Tibetan populations because the individuals who carried it survived and reproduced more successfully than those who did not. An adaptation refined across geological time by a species now extinct is still at this moment keeping people alive on one of the highest and most demanding landscapes on Earth. The jawbone recovered in 2019 from Bashir Karst Cave on the Tibetan Plateau, found at an elevation of approximately 3,280 meters, initially stored for decades in a monastery, before its significance was recognized, added a rare physical dimension to what had been almost entirely a genetic story. The jaw was massive, with teeth larger than those of either Neanderthals or modern humans, and protein analysis linked it unmistakably to the Denisovan lineage. It had been deposited in that cave approximately 160,000 years ago, making it the oldest evidence of human presence on the Tibetan Plateau by a considerable margin, and confirming that Denisovans were not occasional visitors to high altitude, but long-term residents of an environment that would have challenged any hominin not specifically adapted to it. The detail that the jaw was found at 3,280 meters in a region where modern humans without APS-1 variant would struggle to sustain a viable population is not coincidental. It's a record, however, of the species doing something remarkable, thriving across tens of thousands of generations in a place that most of its relatives could not survive. What remains genuinely open, and what some researchers describe as among the most important unresolved questions in paleoanthropology, is how Denisovans reached the island ends of Southeast Asia and the Pacific in sufficient numbers to leave a genetic signature still visible in modern populations. To reach the Philippines, New Guinea, or the eastern Indonesian archipelago, any hominin population would have needed to cross deep ocean channels that remained unbridged, even during the glacial maximum when sea levels dropped by as much as 120 meters and exposed vast continental shelves across the Sunda region. Wallace's Line. The boundary that separates the Asian and Australian faunal zones runs through water deep enough that it has never been a land crossing within the time frame of human evolution. Something carried Denisovan populations or their genes across that boundary, and whatever it was not walking. Some researchers are willing to suggest cautiously that this implies a degree of maritime capability comparable to the early modern human populations who crossed into Sahul around 65,000 years ago. Others argue that the genetic signal could reflect a more complex pattern of admixture and back migration that does not require direct Denisovan seafaring. The question remains open, and the evidence for now does not resolve it cleanly in either direction. Within the Denisovan genome itself, one further layer of complexity waits. When scientists analysed the full genetic sequence recovered from the Denisova cave material, they found traces of DNA from a third unidentified archaic population, one that appears to have diverged from the common ancestor of all later humans even earlier than the split between Neanderthals and Denisovans. This population has no name. It has no fossils. It exists only as a statistical signal in the genome of a species that is itself known primarily from a child's fingerbone and a monastery jawbone. It is a ghost inside a ghost, a lineage within a lineage, and it suggests that the human family tree had branches extending into the past that we have not yet begun to locate in the physical record. That record, when it does yield something physical, occasionally produces discoveries so far outside existing frameworks that the entire shape of the family tree requires revision, as happened in 2003, when a limestone cave on a small Indonesian island gave up bones that did not fit any category anyone had prepared for. The Island Experiments. The limestone cave of Liang Bua sits in the interior of Florestan Island in the Lesser Sunda chain that has never within the time frame of human evolution been connected to the Asian mainland by a land bridge. Even at the lower sea levels of the glacial maximum, when the continental shelves of Southeast Asia lay exposed as a vast and walkable plain called Sundaland, Flores remained separated from the nearest landmass by deep ocean channels that would have required deliberate water crossing to traverse. Whatever arrived on that island arrived by water by accident or by intention on debris or on something more purposeful, and once it arrived it stayed. The island became a laboratory sealed by water on all sides, running its own slow evolutionary experiment across hundreds of thousands of voyages, largely undisturbed by the movements happening on the continents beyond its shores. When an Indonesian-Australian team began excavating Liang Bua in earnest in the early 2000s, they expected to find evidence of early modern human passage tools, animal bones, perhaps traces of the populations that had moved through the region on their way towards Sahul. What they found instead was a skeleton that violated almost every assumption the field had built about the relationship between brain size and behavioral complexity. The individual designated LB1, the first and most complete specimen recovered from Liang Bua, stood approximately 1.06 meters tall at full adult height. The pelvis showed full fusion. The wisdom teeth had erupted. By every standard skeletal marker, this was an adult, not a child, not a juvenile, not a pathological case of stunted development. And yet the brain case, when carefully measured, held a volume of approximately 380 cubic centimeters, comparable to a chimpanzee, and less than a third of the modern human average. The skull itself could be held comfortably in one hand. Researchers who examined it in those first weeks described a quality of cognitive dissonance that the dry language of academic papers struggles to convey. The proportions were simply wrong by every framework available. Small bodies had been documented in island populations before island dwarfism, the process by which large-bodied species reduce in size across generations when resources are limited, and large predators are absent, is well established in the zoological literature. But brains in every mammalian lineage previously studied resist the dwarfing process more stubbornly than bodies. They are metabolically expensive, and evolution does not readily abandon the investment. Whatever had happened on Flores had apparently done something that had not been documented elsewhere in the hominin record. Scattered around the LB1 remains, and in the deeper sediment layers that accumulated over the following excavation seasons were stone tools, not crude flakes, not the simplest possible instruments produced by a species operating at the margins of technical capacity, but carefully made blades, scrapers and points whose sophistication fell within the range of what contemporary modern human populations were producing elsewhere in the world at the same time. Alongside those tools were the bones of Stegodon, a genus of proboscidean related to modern elephants present on Flores in a dwarf island, form that still weighed several hundred kilograms, showing cut marks and burning patterns consistent with systematic butchery and cooking. The implication which researchers stated carefully, and which has not been seriously undermined in the 2 decades since, is that a population of hominins with brains the size of a grapefruit was coordinating the hunting and processing of animals, or many times their own body weight, using tools that required genuine technical skill to produce. The combination refuses to resolve into anything simple. The most widely accepted explanation that Homo floresiensis descended from a Homo erectus population that reached Flores perhaps 700,000 to 1 million years ago, and underwent island dwarfism across hundreds of thousands of isolated generations accounts for the small body, but sits less comfortably with the preserved tool sophistication. If dwarfing reduced brain volume to a third of the ancestral size, Why did behavioral complexity not diminish proportionally? One possibility advanced by researchers studying the internal organization of the flora's brain endocasts is that the dwarfing process was not uniform, that certain regions associated with planning and tool use were preserved or even elaborated relative to the overall reduction in volume, producing a brain that was small in absolute terms but not proportionally impoverished in the areas that matter most for technical behavior. Another possibility, less often stated but difficult to dismiss entirely, is that our models of also sense of the relationship between brain size and cognitive capacity are simply cruder than we have assumed, and that the Floresiensis case is an instruction in humility rather than an anomaly requiring special explanation. The pathology hypothesis, the suggestion that LB1 and the other Langbua individuals were modern humans affected by microcephaly, Laron syndrome or iodine deficiency-related cretinism, was advanced seriously in the years following the initial announcement, and deserves acknowledgement as a genuine scientific debate rather than mere contrarianism. Microcephaly produces small skull volumes in otherwise modern humans, and in the early years of the Floresiensis discussion, before multiple additional individuals had been fully analysed, the single specimen argument had some purchase. What eroded it was the accumulation of skeletal material. The individuals from Langbua shared across multiple specimens a suite of anatomical features that are not produced by any known pathological condition. Wrist bones with a morphology resembling those of Australopithecus, rather than modern humans. Shoulder joints with an orientation more typical of much older hominins. Foot proportions with an unusually long toe relative to the overall foot length. Pathological modern humans do not consistently revert to an ancient anatomical template across the entire skeleton. They are modern humans with something gone wrong in one system. The Liangbua individuals look in their skeletal architecture like something that followed a different evolutionary path for a very long time. The last confirmed Floresiensis remains in the stratigraphic sequence at Liangbua date to approximately 50,000 years ago, a period that coincides within the imprecision of available dating methods with the first evidence of modern human presence in the broader region. Whether that coincidence reflects causation, and if so, of what kind, cannot currently be determined. What can be said is that on the neighbouring island of Luzon, a different island experiment was running in the parallel, one whose bones would not be formally described until 2019, and whose mosaic of primitive and derived features suggested a lineage even harder to place on any existing diagram of human relationships. That lineage and what its existence implies about the crowded evolutionary landscape of island Southeast Asia is where the next trace leads. What the careful mind objects. It is worth pausing here before the narrative carries us further to hold the counter-arguments with the same attention we have given the evidence they push against, not because skepticism is more honest than wonder, or because caution is a virtue superior to curiosity, but because the questions raised by careful critics of this body of research are genuinely substantive, and because a story that does not acknowledge its own weak points is not a story worth trusting. The picture assembled across the preceding chapters is compelling in its broad outlines and in many of its details. It is also in specific and important ways built on evidence that is fragmentary, contested, and in some cases dependent on methodological assumptions that remain actively debated within the field. That deserves to be said plainly without apology and without dismissal. The first and most fundamental objection concerns the ancient DNA evidence, which has become the most rhetorically powerful strand in the new narrative of human diversity, and which carries within it a set of technical vulnerabilities that are easy to understate in popular accounts. When researchers extract genetic material from a bone fragment tens of thousands of years old, the vast majority of what they recover is not ancient human DNA at all. It is microbial contamination bacteria, fungi, soil organisms, and the genetic traces of every modern human who has handled the specimen since its excavation. The ancient human signal, when it exists at all, typically constitutes a small fraction of the total recovered material, and distinguishing genuine archaic sequence from modern contamination requires a battery of chemical and computational filters that are sophisticated but not infallible. The concern is not that the major findings, Neanderthal ancestry in non-African populations, Denisovan ancestry in Melanesian and Tibetan genomes, are fabricated or fundamentally mistaken. The broader consensus around those findings is robust enough that contamination alone cannot account for them. The concern is at the margins the ghost population is detected as statistical residuals in genome comparisons. The specific percentage estimates of archaic ancestry in particular populations, the claims about multiple independent interbreeding events in different geographic locations. These are precisely the results that depend most heavily on the filtering assumptions, and they are also precisely the results that generate the most expansive narrative implications. Some researchers argue, not unreasonably, that the ghost population literature has moved faster than the methodological foundations beneath it can comfortably support. The second objection is taxonomic, and it cuts at something more basic than methodology. The species named and described across the past 2 decades, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis, Homo naledi, Homo longi, have each been proposed on the basis of skeletal material that is in most cases extremely limited. Homo luzonensis was described from 7 teeth, 6 hand and foot bones, and a partial femur belonging to at least 3 individuals. Homo longi, the dragon man, rests primarily on a single skull whose precise provenance, a riverbank near Harbin, China, reportedly recovered in the 1930s and stored in a well for decades before being presented to researchers, introduces questions about context that a specimen found in a controlled stratigraphic excavation would not face. The floresiensis debate over pathology versus genuine species status, though, largely settled in favour of the species interpretation required more than a decade of accumulating skeletal material to resolve, and even now a small number of researchers maintain reservations. The broader issue is one that paleoanthropologists have wrestled with since the field began. Fossils do not come with species labels, and the decision about where to draw a line between regional variation within a species and genuine speciation is, in the absence of behavioural and genetic data, partly a judgment call. Some critics of the current proliferation of species names argue that what the record actually shows is not a forest of distinct human lineages, but a wide variable interconnected metapopulation with considerable regional differentiation, 1 species or perhaps 2 or 3 rather than 8 or 10. The third objection concerns the interpretation of behavioural evidence, and it is perhaps the most difficult to resolve because it depends on questions about intention that physical traces can suggest but never confirm. The claim that Homo naledi deliberately deposited its dead in the Denaledi chamber, navigating a pitch-dark, extremely confined passage repeatedly over many generations for no functional purpose other than the disposal of bodies, is striking precisely because, if true, it would require attributing something very close to ritual behaviour to a species with the brain volume roughly half that of modern humans. The alternative explanations are now collapsed or undiscovered entrants, water transport of remains, predator activity leaving an unusual signature have been examined and largely rejected by the Rising Star team on the grounds that none of them fit the total pattern of the evidence, as well as deliberate placement does. But fits less well is not the same as ruled out, and some researchers argue that the evidentiary bar for a claim as extraordinary as hominin mortuary ritual in a species this archaic should be higher than it currently has been set. The same caution applies in varying degrees to the Cueva de Ardales paintings, to the Shanidar flower burial, and to several other behavioural inferences in the Neanderthal record. Each individual claim can be contested, and the cumulative picture, while suggestive, is assembled from pieces that none of them standing alone would be called decisive. These objections are worth holding, not because they dissolve the pattern, they do not, but because they clarify what kind of pattern it is. It is not a pattern of proof. It's a pattern of accumulation evidence gathering at the edges of what current methods can resolve, pointing in a direction that grows harder to dismiss with each passing excavation season, while retaining genuine uncertainty at its core. The detail is small and it refuses to go away, but refusing to go away is not the same as having arrived. That distinction matters because the next layer of the story requires holding both the evidence and its limits, simultaneously beginning with the question of what exactly happened when all of these lineages began to occupy the same landscapes at the same time. The Shared Valley. Sometime around 55,000 years ago, in the limestone hills of what is now the northern Israel, 2 populations of humans were living within walking distance of each other. We know this not from any single dramatic find, but from the stratigraphy of several cave sites in the Mount Carmel range, Kebro, Tabun Kafzeb School, where the occupation layers of Neanderthals and early modern humans alternate, across tens of thousands of years of sediment, sometimes separated by only a few centimeters of deposit, representing a few centuries of time. Neither population appears to have permanently displaced the other in a single decisive event. Instead, the caves seem to have changed hands repeatedly, as if the two groups were moving through the same landscape on overlapping seasonal circuits, occasionally occupying the same shelter, leaving their tools and their dead in the same earth, and then withdrawing again. The Levant, positioned at the junction of Africa and Eurasia, was a crossroads in the most literal sense, a place where the expanding range of modern humans moving north out of Africa met the southern boundary of a Neanderthal territory that had been established for hundreds of thousands of years before any sapiens arrived to contest it. What those meetings looked like in practice is something the archaeological record preserves only in outline. The tools found at the Levantine sites do not divide cleanly along species lines. Some Neanderthal layers contain implements that appear to draw on technological traditions more commonly associated with modern humans, and some early sapiens layers show Mousterian-style napping that was the Neanderthal standard across their entire range. Whether this represents direct exchange, one group watching another work and adopting what it saw, or independent convergence, or the inheritance of shared earlier traditions, remains debated. But the genetic evidence, which the stones themselves cannot provide, fills in at least part of what the tools leave ambiguous. Modern humans outside sub-Saharan Africa carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, and the pattern of which segments are shared across populations suggests that the primary interbreeding events occurred not in Europe, where Neanderthals eventually made their last stand, but in the Levant, precisely where the alternating cave layers say the two populations were closest for the longest time. The DNA and the stratigraphy tell the same story from different angles. These were not brief accidental encounters. They were sustained, recurring, and intimate enough to produce children, who survived, reproduced, and carried both lineages forward. The asymmetry in the genetic signal is one of the details that researchers return to with particular care. Neanderthal DNA flows into modern human genomes at a level consistently detectable across Eurasian populations, but the reverse modern human DNA persisting in Neanderthal populations is almost entirely absent from the ancient genomes so far recovered. That asymmetry could mean many things. It might reflect the demographic reality that modern human populations were larger and growing while Neanderthal groups were smaller and under pressure, so that hybrid individuals raised within modern human communities were more likely to leave descendants than those raised in Neanderthal ones. It might reflect something about the direction of mate exchange, a pattern in which women moved between groups more often than men, as is documented in many historical hunter-gatherer societies, and in which the direction of that movement favoured incorporation into sapiens bands. Or it might reflect a darker arithmetic that in encounters where one group was numerically dominant and the other was not, the nature of contact was not always symmetric in any sense. The record does not say. What it preserves is the outcome, not the process, and the outcome was a one-directional transfer of genetic material whose social meaning we can only approach through analogy and inference. In Central Asia, a different kind of encounter was likely unfolding across a much larger and less densely documented landscape. The Denisovan range, inferred from the distribution of their genetic legacy in modern populations, extended from the Siberian highlands, where their only confirmed physical remains have been found, all the way to the tropical islands of the Western Pacific, a sweep of territory so vast that the encounters with modern humans moving eastward out of the Levant and across southern Asia must have been multiple, geographically dispersed and spread across many thousands of years. The Tibetan Plateau gene transfer, the Melanesian ancestry signal, and the separate Denisovan contribution identified in Philippine Eta populations all appear to represent distinct admixture events in different locations and at different times, suggesting not a single moment of contact but a long, episodic series of meetings between expanding sapiens populations and resident Denisovan groups, whose own range was perhaps already contracting under pressures we cannot currently identify. Each meeting left its signature in a different part of the modern human genome, a geographic archive of encounters written in the language of allele frequencies rather than words. What is perhaps most difficult to hold in mind, given the distance of those events and the dryness of the evidence through which we approach them, is the quality of ordinariness those encounters must have had for the people living through them. The cave layers at Mount Carmel were not deposited in a moment of historical crisis. They accumulated across centuries of seasonal movement, hunting, birth, death, and the maintenance of fire through cold nights. The individuals who left Neanderthal DNA in the modern human genome did not know they were participating in an event that would still be detectable 50,000 years later in the blood of people living on other continents. They were doing what all humans in all periods do, navigating the landscape in front of them, making alliances or enemies, raising children and trying to survive the winter. What neither they nor we can fully see from inside the moment is the larger pattern assembling itself across millennia, the slow shift in which one branch of the family was growing, while the others were quietly unfinny and in some places suddenly beginning to thin. The long twilight, 40,000 years, is not a moment. It is not a catastrophe with a date, not a border that a species crosses and fails to return from. It is in geological terms a brief interval, a thin band of sediment, but lived from the inside it would have been 40 centuries of winters, 40 centuries of migrations and births and the slow accumulation of small losses that do not announce themselves as endings until the ending has already happened. The disappearance of the Neanderthals from the European and Western Asian record did not occur as an event. It occurred as a gradient, a dimming that moved unevenly across a landscape of refugees and corridors, leaving populations isolated in favourable pockets long after the broader range had contracted, until even those pockets emptied the last confirmed traces clustering in southern Iberia, at sites near Gibraltar, where the climate remained mild enough and the prey dense enough to support small groups for perhaps several thousand years after Neanderthal populations had vanished from everywhere else. Whether those final Iberian individuals knew they were the last of anything is a question that dissolves into the kind of silence the record cannot penetrate. What the stratigraphy preserves is simply absence tools, hearths, bones, and then none. The mechanisms that produce that absence have been argued over for decades, and the honest answer supported by most current researchers is that no single mechanism is adequate. Climate is the broadest frame. The period between roughly 45,000 and 30,000 years ago was marked by a series of rapid oscillations in European and Western Asian environments. What climatologists call Dansgaard-Oeschger events and Heinrich events, in which temperatures swung dramatically within timescales of decades to centuries. Forests fragmented and reassembled prey species shifted their ranges, and the stable ecological relationships that Neanderthal populations had built, their subsistence strategies around, were repeatedly disrupted before they could fully reconstitute. Neanderthals had survived previous glacial cycles successfully, which is sometimes used to argue that climate alone cannot explain their final disappearance. But those earlier cycles were navigated in the absence of a competing human population. What the last cycle brought was both a destabilized environment and a new generalist competitor arriving simultaneously, and that combination may have been qualitatively different from anything Neanderthal populations had previously faced. The competition argument does not require organized conflict to carry explanatory weight. The demographic mathematics of two populations occupying overlapping ranges with one growing and one static or declining are unforgiving even when the interactions between them are entirely peaceful. If modern human groups could extract slightly more calories from the same landscape through broader dietary flexibility, more efficient projectile technology, or denser social networks that allowed information about resource locations to travel faster than individuals could walk, then over the span of several centuries, the differential in reproductive success would compound. Slightly more surviving children in one group, slightly fewer in the other season after season, until the valley that had supported two populations could support only one. No violence required, no conscious displacement, just the quiet arithmetic of survival rates accumulating across generations into an outcome that looks from our distance like replacement. The Heinrich Event 4. A period of severe cooling that struck approximately 40,000 years ago and lasted several centuries may have been the specific pressure that pushed already stressed Neanderthal populations below the demographic threshold from which recovery was possible. A final destabilization in a sequence of destabilizations that had been eroding their numbers for thousands of years before the crisis point arrived. Disease is the mechanism that leaves the least evidence and may have carried the most weight in specific encounters. When previously isolated populations meet the microbial communities they carry do not negotiate. Pathogens that a population has lived with across generations, developing partial immunity through repeated exposure, can be devastating to a population encountering them for the first time, and modern humans moving out of Africa carried the immunological history of an entirely different disease environment than the one Neanderthal populations had been adapted to across their hundreds of thousands of years in Eurasia. The reverse was also true. Eurasian pathogens would have posed novel challenges to incoming sapiens groups, and some genetic evidence suggests that certain Neanderthal-derived immune variants, particularly in the HLA system, spread rapidly through modern human populations, precisely because they conferred resistance to local diseases that African-origin immune profiles were not prepared for. The borrowing of Neanderthal immune genes by modern humans may be in part a record of the price paid for entering a new disease landscape, a price that the Neanderthals themselves encountering African pathogens for the first time may have paid more heavily and without the option of genetic rescue from the other side. And then there is absorption, the possibility that for some Neanderthal individuals and groups the ending was not death, but dissolution into a larger population, a gradual process of incorporation through interbreeding and cultural assimilation that erased the separate identity without erasing the genes. The 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA carried by people of Eurasian ancestry today is not a trivial inheritance. It represents millions of base pairs of functional genetic sequence, still influencing immune response, skin physiology, circadian rhythm, and pain sensitivity in living people. That inheritance required not one but many successful hybrid births across an extended period. Children who survived were integrated into communities, found mates, and left their own descendants. For those individuals, the boundary between species was not a wall but a threshold that people crossed and recrossed, and the lineage that called itself Neanderthal thinned not only through attrition but through merger, its genetic contributions persisting inside the very population that was by every other measure replacing it. What that replacement looked like from the ground in any specific valley, in any specific winter, is where the fossil record falls silent, and the next layer of evidence must speak. The place of stars. In the Sotho language spoken across much of southern Africa, the word Dinaledi means stars. The researchers who named the chamber where Homo naledi's bones were found chose that word for reasons that are easy to understand once you know the geography of the place. The chamber sits at the end of a passage system, so confined, so geometrically hostile to human entry, that reaching it requires descending a near vertical shaft, crawling through a horizontal squeeze, and then pressing through a vertical chute approximately 18 centimeters wide at its narrowest point, roughly the diameter of a dinner plate, before dropping into the cavity below. In absolute darkness, without the headlamps and harnesses, and radio communication that the 2013 excavation team used navigating that passage would require a knowledge of the system so intimate it could only have been built across many visits. The chamber itself is unremarkable in its dimensions, low-ceilinged and irregular, with a floor of fine pale sediment that turned out when the team began carefully brushing it to be almost entirely composed of human bone. Not the bones of one individual, not the bones of a small group killed in a single event, but the remains of at least 15 individuals spanning every life stage from infant to elderly adult, and as subsequent excavation seasons revealed, eventually more than that, drawn from what appears to be a population that returned to this specific place across many generations to leave its dead. The 6 scientists who did most of the excavation work in the Dinaledi chamber were selected partly for their professional qualifications and partly for their physical dimensions. The passage simply could not accommodate most adult bodies, and the team that became known informally as the underground astronauts spent weeks working in a space barely large enough to sit upright, passing fragments of bone out through the rock in small containers, building a skeletal inventory that grew more puzzling with each piece added. When the bones were finally described in detail and the anatomical picture assembled, the result was a species that seemed to have been assembled from components borrowed from different periods of human evolutionary history. The feet were almost modern arched with a robust heel, structured for efficient long-distance bipedal walking. The legs were long relative to the arms, consistent with a body plan oriented around terrestrial movement. The teeth were small, organized in a pattern more typical of later Homo than of early toolmakers, but the shoulders were high and shrugged in a manner characteristic of much more archaic hominins. The fingers were curved and powerful, the hands capable of both strong gripping and fine manipulation, but not quite identical to ours in their joint geometry. The skull was small brain volume, ranging between approximately 460 and 610 cubic centimeters across the specimens recovered, and the torso showed a primitive flared rib cage that called to mind body plans from considerably earlier in the genus Homo's history. The species was a mosaic in the most literal sense, a creature that had apparently been evolving along its own trajectory long enough to develop a thoroughly idiosyncratic combination of features, some primitive and some derived, that did not correspond to any previously known position on the family tree. What the geological dating eventually revealed about when this mosaic creature was alive is the detail that most disrupted the interpretive framework that researchers had initially brought to the site. When the first descriptions of Homo naledi appeared in 2015, the assumption shared by most of the field was that such a small-brained, anatomically archaic hominin must be very old to survive. From the earliest chapters of the genus Homo, perhaps 2 million years in age, preserved in the cave environment like a biological time capsule, the dates returned in 2017 made that assumption impossible to maintain. The bones in the Dinaledi chamber were between approximately 236,000 and 335,000 years old. At the younger end of that range, Homo naledi was alive in southern Africa, at the same time that the earliest anatomically modern humans were appearing in the fossil record elsewhere on the continent, at Jebel el-Houd in Morocco, at Omo Kibish in Ethiopia. Two radically different human forms separated by perhaps 700,000 years of divergent evolution were present on the same landmass simultaneously. The map of African human diversity in the Middle Pleistocene, already complicated by the Heidelbergensis and Rhodesiensis question, grew more complicated still. The presence of Homo naledi in southern Africa during this period raises a question that has not yet found a satisfying answer. Did these two populations ever encounter each other? The geographic overlap is plausible. The Rising Star System lies in the cradle of humankind, a region of South Africa that has yielded hominin fossils spanning several million years, and early sapiens populations are known to have been present across eastern and southern Africa during the same broad interval. Whether they met, traded, competed, interbred, or simply occupied different enough ecological niches to pass through the same landscape without significant interaction is something the current evidence cannot resolve. No Homo naledi DNA has been recovered. The cave environment, warm and mineral-rich, is hostile to the long-term nucleic acid preservation, so the genetic question that has transformed the Neanderthal and Denisovan stories remains for now closed. What remains open, and what gives the Dinaledi chamber its particular weight in the broader narrative, is the behavioural inference that the bones themselves suggest. The chamber was not a place where bodies accumulated by accident. It was a destination, one that cost effort and risk to reach, that offered no food, no water, no shelter, and no practical advantage of any kind, and that appears to have been used for the same purpose across many generations. That purpose, whatever its precise nature, required carrying a body or directing others to carry a body through darkness and through stone to a specific hidden place and leaving it there. Whether the word ritual belongs to that act is a question the record cannot settle. What the record does settle is that the act was repeated, and that repetition implies intention. What that intention might have shared with the mortuary behaviour already documented in Neanderthals, and what it might tell us about the distribution of symbolic cognition across the human family, is a thread the next chapter pulls toward the surface: the architecture of minds. Somewhere in northeastern China, in sediment near the Songhua River, a skull was recovered in the 1930s, reportedly by workers constructing a bridge, who recognised it as unusual and passed it along a chain of custody that eventually led to a monastery where it was stored for decades in a well wrapped in cloth, its significance unrecognised by the people who were keeping it. When it was finally examined by researchers and formally described in 2021, the skull turned out to be enormous, a brain case with a volume comparable to modern humans, orbits so deep they cast the face in shadow, and a combination of features broad-low, with pronounced brow ridges and a wide nasal aperture that did not correspond to any previously named species. The team that described it proposed calling it Homo longi, from the Mandarin word for dragon, and suggested that it might represent a lineage more closely related to modern humans than Neanderthals are. Not everyone agreed. Some researchers argued it was more likely a Denisovan, a face at last to attach to the ghost lineage, known almost entirely from DNA and a monastery jawbone. Others placed it within a broader cluster of Middle and Late Pleistocene Asian hominins. Fossils from Dlisai, from Jinshan, from several other Chinese localities that together suggest a regional population of considerable antiquity and uncertain relationship to both the Western archaic humans and to us. The skull from the Songhua River sits in that uncertainty without that resolving it, which is precisely what makes it useful as a frame for the questions this chapter needs to approach. Those questions are about mind specifically about what the accumulated evidence across the preceding chapters suggests, guarding the cognitive lives of the various human species that shared the Pleistocene world, and whether the differences between them were differences of kind or merely of degree. The traditional answer, embedded in the older narrative of human evolution as a linear ascent towards sapiens, was clear. Modern humans crossed a cognitive threshold that other species had approached but not reached a threshold involving symbolic thought, language, and cumulative culture, and it was this crossing that explains both the behavioural explosion visible in the archaeological record after roughly 50,000 years ago, and the subsequent disappearance of every other human lineage. The evidence examined across this documentary supports part of that narrative, while complicating the rest of it in ways that are difficult to set aside. The complications begin with the Neanderthal data, which by now represents the most extensively studied comparison case. Neanderthals buried their dead with apparent intentionality across multiple sites and multiple continents. They produced pigment-based markings in caves before modern humans entered Europe. They made personal ornaments, perforated shells, animal teeth, eagle talons that served no utilitarian function, recognizable in the subsistence record. They developed a chemical adhesive manufacturing process, requiring controlled pyrolysis of birch bark, which is by any reasonable definition a form of applied chemistry. These are not the behaviours of a species operating below the threshold of symbolic cognition. They are the behaviours of a species that had crossed that threshold, or was straddling it, or had developed a form of symbolic life different enough from ours that our categories for assessing it may not be perfectly calibrated. The Homo naledi mortuary evidence, if the deliberate deposition interpretation survives, continued scrutiny pushes the question further, suggesting that some version of meaningful behaviour toward the dead may have existed in a lineage with a brain volume less than half our own. The threshold, if it exists at all, may be considerably lower than the older framework assumed, or it may not be a threshold at all, but a gradient along which different species were distributed at different points. What does appear to have distinguished modern human populations, particularly in the period between roughly 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, is not symbolic capacity in isolation, but the scale and connectivity of the networks through which symbolic information moved. In late Pleistocene Africa and then across Eurasia, the archaeological record shows raw materials, obsidian, marine shells, specific pigment minerals travelling hundreds of kilometres from their geological sources to sites where they were used or deposited. Decorative styles and tool designs appear at sites separated by distances that individual bands could not have covered in a single season's movement. This kind of long-range material distribution does not require that any one individual travelled vast distances. It requires only that objects and ideas moved through chains of exchange gift networks, marriage, alliances, trading relationships that connected communities across landscapes too large for any single group to directly inhabit. The density and geographic reach of those networks is on current evidence to have been greater in modern human populations than in Neanderthal or Denisovan ones, and that difference in network scale may carry more explanatory weight than any difference in raw cognitive capacity between individuals. The demographic hypothesis builds on this observation. In a population of 50 individuals, the number of people likely to independently generate a genuinely novel technological or social innovation in any given generation is very small. In a population of 5,000 connected by exchange relationships that allow useful innovations to spread, the effective pool of cognitive resources is immeasurably larger, and once an innovation spreads, it becomes the baseline from which the next generation innovates further. Population size and connectivity do not make any individual smarter, but they make the collective behaviour of the group more responsive, more cumulative, and more resilient to local failures. If modern human populations were by the late Pleistocene larger and more densely networked than their archaic relatives, then the behavioural differences visible in the archaeological record may reflect demographic and social structure as much as neurological architecture. The Red Deer Cave, people of southwestern China whose skulls show a mosaic of modern and archaic features and whose remains date to as recently as 14,000 years ago, are a reminder that the late Pleistocene landscape of Asia was still producing anatomical surprises long after the conventional endpoint of human diversification, and that the cognitive picture, like the anatomical one, may have been more varied and more regionally differentiated than the broad sapiens versus archaics frame allows. Language sits at the centre of the most accounts of the sapiens' advantage, and it is the dimension the most resistant to direct evidence. The hyoid bone, the small horseshoe-shaped structure that anchors the tongue musculature and provides indirect evidence about the range of sounds a species could produce, is preserved in several Neanderthal specimens, and is in its morphology essentially identical to the modern human version. The FOXP2 gene, associated in modern humans with fine motor control of the vocal apparatus and with certain aspects of syntactic processing, has been recovered from Neanderthal DNA and shows the same derived variants found in our own species. Anatomically, Neanderthals could speak. Whether they spoke in ways that enabled the kind of open-ended symbolic reference, the ability to talk about things that are not present, not visible, not yet existing, that seems to underlie the most distinctively modern human behaviours, is a question that bone and gene together cannot answer. What the evidence permits is the observation that the vocal and neural infrastructure for complex language was present in at least one archaic lineage and possibly more, while the behavioural output associated with the most elaborated forms of language appears most clearly and most consistently in modern human assemblages. That asymmetry between capacity and output, between the anatomical possibility and the archaeological reality, is perhaps the most honest summary of where the evidence currently stands, and it opens rather than closes the question of what the final chapter of the shared world looked like from the inside. What we carry: 7 teeth, 6 hand and foot bones, and a fragment of femur. This is the physical remainder of Homo luzonensis, the species described in 2019, from material recovered at Calo Cave on the Philippine island of Luzon. By the standards of paleoanthropology, which has built entire chapters of the human story from less, that inventory is not embarrassingly thin, but it is thin enough that the picture it offers is more outline than portrait. A silhouette pressed into the record without the internal detail that would allow confident characterization of how this population lived, how it thought, or precisely how it arrived at the anatomical configuration that made it when the bones were formally compared to every known hominin as something genuinely unprecedented. The teeth were small and organised in a pattern superficially similar to modern humans, but with cusp arrangements that recalled much older forms. The finger bones and toe bones were curved in a manner more typical of species that still spent significant time in arboreal environments, the same curving seen in Australopithecus in early Homo in lineages separated from Luzonensis by millions of years of evolution, and the femur fragment, the only lower limb element recovered, suggested a body substantially smaller than any mainland contemporary. Whatever Homo luzonensis was, it had been on Luzon long enough and in isolation deep enough to become something the rest of the human family had stopped resembling. The evidence of how long that isolation had been running comes not from the hominin fossils themselves, but from a separate discovery at a different site on the same island. Butchered rhinoceros bones with cut marks consistent with stone tool use and percussion fractures consistent with marrow extraction dated to approximately 709,000 years ago. No hominin bones were recovered in direct association with those marks, so the identity of the butcher cannot be confirmed, but the implication is difficult to avoid. Some hominin population was on Luzon before 700,000 years ago, processing large animals with stone tools, and had presumably been there long enough to have crossed the deep ocean channels separating the Philippine archipelago from the Asian mainland. Homo erectus is the most frequently proposed candidate given what we know of their geographic range and their apparent capacity for water crossing. If those early arrivals were indeed the ancestors of Luzonensis, then the lineage had been running its island experiment for the better part of 1 million years, before the first modern human set foot in the region long enough for the accumulated weight of selection pressure, genetic drift and ecological specialization to produce something that looked in its bones like a creature assembled from evolutionary periods that should not overlap. That image, a species carrying the architectural echoes of its deep past into a present that had moved on without it, is one that surfaces repeatedly across the human family's late history, and it points toward a dimension of the broader story that the preceding chapters have approached, but not yet addressed directly. The question of what the other humans left inside those of us who remain. The genetic inheritance is not metaphorical, it is structural, functional, and in several documented cases actively beneficial in the environments where it operates. The Neanderthal-derived variants in the HLA immune gene complex still present in the genomes of people across Eurasia represent borrowed solutions to pathogen environments that modern human immune systems had never independently encountered, solutions refined across hundreds of thousands of years of Neanderthal exposure to the disease landscape of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, and transferred into the incoming sapiens gene pool at exactly the moment when those incoming populations needed them most. The Denisovan APAS1 variant, functioning in the cells of Tibetan highlanders at this moment, is an adaptation developed by a species that no longer exists, still performing the physiological work it was shaped to perform across geological time in bodies that inherited it. Through the imperfect and intimate process of two populations producing children together in a landscape that no longer looks the way it did when that meeting occurred. There are subtler inheritances as well, ones whose cost-benefit balance is harder to assess from our current vantage. Neanderthal-derived gene segments have been associated in modern population studies with differences in pain sensitivity, in patterns of fat storage, in the regulation of circadian rhythms, and in the architecture of certain immune responses that manifest today as elevated risk for autoimmune conditions in some populations. These are not straightforwardly beneficial inheritances. They are adaptations calibrated to a world the physical demands of sustained close-range hunting, the nutritional cycles of a highly seasonal diet, the immune challenges of a small mobile band with intense exposure to raw animal tissue that no longer describes the environment in which most of their carriers live. A Neanderthal-derived blood clotting variant that reduced mortality from deep puncture wounds inflicted by large prey animals may, in a population that spends most of its time sedentary in climate-controlled spaces, consuming processed foods, manifest primarily as an elevated risk of thrombosis. The gene is doing exactly what it evolved to do. The world around it has changed faster than selection can track. What was an asset in one kind of life becomes in another a liability, and the liability is written in a language we borrowed from people who are gone. Across the islands of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the Denisovan inheritance runs deeper in some populations than anywhere else on Earth. In the Magbucon people of the Philippines, one of the Negrito populations of Luz on the same island where Homo luzonensis left its curved finger bones in Callao Cave, researchers have identified a Denisovan ancestry signal higher than that found in any other modern population, yet sampled estimated at approximately 5% of the genome. The geographic coincidence is striking without being explicable. The island that sheltered one archaic lineage for perhaps 700,000 years also appears to have been a site of contact between modern humans and Denisovans, intensive enough to leave the highest known Denisovan ancestry in any living community. Whether those two facts are connected, whether the Denisovans who interbred with the ancestors of the Atum Magbucon were related to descendants of or entirely separate from the population that eventually became Homo luzonensis, is a question the evidence does not currently permit answering. The detail is there sitting in the record, refusing to resolve into either coincidence or connections across Flores where Homo floresiensis left its tools and bones in Langbua. The oral tradition preserved in local communities describes a creature called the Ebigogo, small pot-bellied cave-dwelling, capable of mimicking human speech, gone from the landscape within what some versions of the story characterize as recent memory, driven from their refuge by villagers who eventually lost patience with their theft of food and children. Anthropologists approach such traditions with appropriate caution. Folklore reshapes itself across generations in ways that can obscure or invent the details that matter most, and universal archetypes of small wild people appear in traditions from cultures with no archaeological record of anything resembling floresiensis. But the tradition exists on the specific island where the bones exist, describing a creature with the specific characteristics the bones suggest, and that convergence is not nothing, even if it is not proof. What all of these threads, the borrowed immune genes, the altitude adaptations still functioning in highland cells, The oral memories of small cave people on an island, where small cave people actually lived, have in common is that they are afterimages. They are what persists when the source has gone, not the presence of the other humans, but the impression their presence left in the molecules of our bodies, and the stories we tell in the dark about what used to share the world with us. The final chapter asks what it means to be the only impression maker left, the last light. The most recent confirmed date for a non-sapiens human in the archaeological record belongs on current evidence to a Neanderthal population in southwestern Europe, a date clustering around 37,000 to 40,000 years before the present, drawn from sites near the southern coast of the Iberian Peninsula, where the climate held mild long enough to sustain the last fragments of a range that had once extended from the Atlantic to the Altai. After that, the record falls quiet in a way it had not been quiet for nearly 2 million years. Not quiet in the sense of empty, the sites fill immediately with modern human material, with blade tools and bone points and the first European cave paintings, with evidence of populations expanding rapidly into every ecological niche the previous occupants had held. Quiet in the sense that a particular kind of signal disappears from the sediment and does not return. The morphology changes, the tool traditions change, and something that had been part of the world's texture for longer than our species has existed, the presence of other kinds of human minds moving through the same landscapes, is simply no longer there. What that loss meant to the people living through it, we cannot know. The modern humans who moved into southern Iberia in the millennia following the Neanderthal disappearance left no record of recognition, no burial goods placed at the edge of an old Neanderthal hearth, no symbolic gesture that might suggest an awareness of what had been there before. That absence of commemoration should not be read as indifference. The archaeological record does not preserve most gestures, most words, most of what people understood about their world. But it is a reminder that the significance we now attach to the diversity that was lost is entirely retrospective. The people who were present for the ending did not know they were present for an ending. They were navigating the winter in front of them, following the herds, maintaining the fires. The historical weight accumulated later in the sediment, waiting for us to arrive with our instruments and our questions. Those questions have grown more precise and more numerous across the past 2 decades than across the entire preceding century of paleoanthropology combined. Ancient DNA, once a technical impossibility, is now retrieved routinely from material tens of thousands of years old. Protein analysis extends that reach further back into periods and environments where nucleic acids can not survive, pulling phylogenetic information from the crystalline structure of tooth enamel. Every few years, a new excavation season or a new analytical technique produces something that requires the family tree to be redrawn a finger bone in Siberia that becomes an entire species, a monastery jawbone that places that species on the Tibetan Plateau 160,000 years ago, a skull in a Chinese well that may be more closely related to us than Neanderthals are. The rate of discovery is accelerating precisely as the analytical tools become powerful enough to extract meaning from fragments that would have been uninformative a generation ago. We are not at the end of this story. We may be closer to the beginning of understanding it than the accumulated literature suggests. And yet the thing that the accelerating discovery cannot restore is the thing that was actually lost. Not the genes, those persist distributed across the genomes of the people alive today in patterns that researchers are still mapping. Not the tools, those remain in the sediment, recoverable by careful excavation, readable by careful analysis. What was lost was the interiority, the specific quality of experience that each of those lineages carried, the way the world looked. From inside a Neanderthal skull, adapted to Ice Age light, the way distance felt to a Denisovan, crossing a high-altitude pass in thin air the way the forest on Flores registered, to a small body moving through it, with stone blades and a knowledge of stegodon behaviour built across generations of close observation. Those inner worlds, as real as ours, as particular as ours, as unrepeatable as ours, are gone in a way that no instrument will recover. The bones tell us the shape of the container. They cannot tell us what it was like to be inside it. That irreversibility is the detail the present moment is least equipped to sit with comfortably. We live in a period when the tools for recovering the past are improving faster than at any previous point in the history of science, and the temptation is to imagine that the gap between what we know and what happened is a gap that will eventually close, that patience and technologies together will eventually produce a complete picture. but completeness in this case is not available. The molecules preserve function, the bones preserve form, the sediment preserves proximity. None of them preserve meaning, and meaning is what the other humans had meaning. They made meaning, they shared meaning, they organized their lives into something more than the accumulation of survival decisions. That meaning is the part of the human inheritance that cannot be extracted from enamel or read from an allele frequency. It existed, and then it stopped existing, and the stopping left no trace that our instruments can resolve. What remains is the pattern, not proof, never proof, but the shape that the evidence keeps returning to regardless of which angle it is approached from a world that was for most of human evolutionary time inhabited by multiple kinds of minds, each adapted to its own corner of the possible, each carrying its own particular version of the capacity for wonder and loss and the maintenance of fire through the cold dark. That world narrowed. It narrowed unevenly across many thousands of years through mechanisms we can partially reconstruct and partially only infer, and it narrowed to this one species carrying fragments of all the others in its genome, and in its oldest stories standing at the edge of a record it is only beginning to read. The record does not resolve into a conclusion. It opens instead into a kind of stillness. The stillness of sediment undisturbed for 40,000 years of a cave mouth in southern Iberia where the last fire burned, and was not relit of all the distances between what the evidence shows and what it cannot yet say. That stillness is where this chapter rests, and where the long descent towards sleep begins. Return for a moment to where this began. A cave in the Altai Mountains. A fragment of bone no wider than a thumbnail pulled from sediment that had held it undisturbed for perhaps 50,000 years. A child's smallest finger. The researchers who sent it to Leipzig did not know what they were sending. The laboratory that received it did not know what it held. The knowledge arrived only after the careful slow work of extraction and comparison. And even then, what it revealed was not an answer, but an opening the outline of a species, a lineage, a whole branch of the human family that had been living and dying and moving across half of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years without ever appearing in any diagram we had drawn of ourselves. The bone did not explain, it simply refused to fit, and that refusal turned out to be more informative than any confirmation could have been. That is in some sense the shape of everything this documentary has traced. Not a series of answers accumulating toward a conclusion, but a series of refusals, artifacts, and bones and gene sequences that decline to support the simpler story that keep returning the researcher to the same uncomfortable position of not quite knowing. The Neanderthal skull that turns out to hold a larger brain than ours, the Hobbit tools too sophisticated for the brain that made them, the mortuary chamber reached through 18 centimeters of rock used generation after generation by a species whose cognitive capacity we thought we had already measured and found modest. The oral tradition, on a small Indonesian island describing creatures that the fossil record confirms were actually there. Each of these is a small crack in a surface that looked from a distance sealed. Up close, none of them close again. There is a particular quality to knowledge that arrives in fragments, knowledge about deep time, about people who left no writing, no continuous tradition, no direct transmission of their experience into ours. It does not accumulate into certainty the way we expect knowledge to accumulate. It gathers instead into probability, into suggestion, into the kind of careful language that keeps saying may and might, and the evidence is consistent with language that can feel when you are tired, and the night is long like an evasion. It is not an evasion. It is the most honest form of what the record permits. The sediment preserved the bone preserved the molecule preserved the sequence. But the sequence is not the child. The sequence is the outermost echo of a life that had weight and warmth and duration. A child who lived in a mountain cave, who was known by the people around her, who is now known to us only by the smallest bone of her smallest finger. That distance between the sequence and the child is not a problem to be solved. It is the condition of the knowledge. It is what deep time does to memory. It keeps the shape and releases the substance, leaving us to infer carefully and incompletely what the shape once held. What is perhaps worth resting with as the questions settle into the dark is the implication that runs beneath all the evidence this documentary has traced, quieter than any of the specific findings, more difficult to hold than any of the dates, or the percentages or the tool typologies. For most of the time that beings capable of something like wonder have existed on this planet, that wonder was distributed across more than one kind of mind. The Neanderthal who carried pigment into a cave in southern Spain and pressed it against the wall was doing something recognizable to us across 65,000 years of separation. What it meant to them, whether it meant anything in the sense we mean when we use that word, or whether meaning itself looked different from inside that skull, we cannot say. But the gesture was made in darkness by firelight, by a hand that left its impression in a place where we eventually found it. That impression is still there, the cave still holds it. Perhaps that is enough for tonight to carry into sleep, not the resolution of anything, but the simple fact of all those fires burning in all those different darknesses, each one tended by hands, somewhat like yours in mines. We are only beginning to approach across a distance that grows neither smaller nor larger for being measured. Rest now. Traveller, the questions will still be there when morning comes, the bones will still be in the earth. The gene that keeps people breathing on the Tibetan Plateau will still be doing its quiet work in cells that have never heard the name of the species that shaped it. The dark is old and patient, and it has held stranger things than sleep. Let it hold you now.